Welcome to my scientifically informed insider look at mental health topics. If you find this video to be interesting or helpful, please like it and subscribe to my channel. Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question is, what is the trail of destruction that we see associated with borderline personality disorder? Now, a while back I made a video on narcissistic personality disorder and the trail of destruction associated with that. And I had a number of requests to specifically look at borderline personality disorder in the same way. So when I use the term trail of destruction, what I'm really talking about here are the negative outcomes in terms of functioning, interpersonal relationships, career, financial, and physical health that we see associated with certain disorders, including cluster B personality disorders and specifically borderline personality disorder. Some of the damage, especially the interpersonal relationship damage we see with borderline personality disorder, does rise to the level of beyond repair, but sometimes it is repairable. One of the difficulties with borderline personality disorder, though, of course, is the symptoms are usually thought of as stable throughout the lifetime. So this construct, this idea of the trail of destruction, this isn't unique to borderline personality disorder or personality disorders in general. We see this idea that relationships can be damaged and there can be other consequences. We see this with substance use disorder, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, intermittent explosive disorder, paranoid personality disorder, and even obsessive-compulsive disorder. There are also a number of other disorders that have this same type of pattern we see, this same area of damage. So in working to treat mental disorders, this is important to keep in mind. We don't see these issues just with one particular disorder. This is something we see across a lot of disorders. We also see a trail of destruction sometimes in individuals who have no mental disorders. So the idea that somebody can damage relationships and cause damage to their career, this exists for everybody potentially. Now this term trail of destruction, of course, is a colloquial term. It's a term we see in the popular culture. We don't really see it in the research literature. And there are a lot of different terms that are similar that we also see used in the popular culture, like borderline chaos, borderline tornado, which has kind of a natural disaster element to it there. We see borderline radioactivity, and also I've seen destructive whirlwind, see that term used. So borderline personality disorder causes suffering for the person who has the disorder, for that individual, and sometimes tremendous suffering, but it also has consequences for romantic partners, family, friends, and coworkers. So the destructive element of the disorder is not isolated to just the person who has the disorder. Mental health counselors can see this effect firsthand if they're working with a client and that client is okay with involving family or friends as part of the treatment. So involving family and friends in treatment is often a good idea for somebody who has the disorder, but of course the individual with the disorder would have to consent to that. And there'd have to be some other ethical considerations that are made. But either way, we see that these different people interact with individuals with borderline personality disorder, and they have their own perspective on how they've been affected by it. So they recognize this trail of destruction from different perspectives and to different extents. Somebody with the disorder can oftentimes see it, even if they don't have 100% insight. And family and friends can, of course, see it, but again, their perspective is limited, not usually due to a lack of insight, but just due to their position. They only see the person from a certain perspective, as I indicated. In my career, I've treated several hundred people that have borderline personality disorder, and I've had the opportunity to talk to a number of family and friends of individuals with this disorder. And in my experience, I think a lot of times these individuals are just trying to communicate the impact of having a relationship with somebody who has borderline personality disorder. I don't think by using these terms, they're necessarily trying to worsen the stigma associated with the disorder. Rather, just trying to communicate frustration and what's actually going on, the different consequences they feel, and how they struggle with those consequences in their own lives. They want to help the person with borderline personality disorder, but they also need to protect themselves. So it comes down to setting boundaries. And if we look specifically at some of the different terms I used before that I've heard of, like borderline tornado and chaos and radioactivity, I think you can see in these terms a lot of these characteristics are captured. For example, I mentioned a tornado is a natural disaster. So this really captures this element that individuals who are relating to somebody with the disorder understand that the behavior isn't necessarily done on purpose. It's not done out of some sort of evil disposition. Rather, it's done because of the symptoms of the disorder. It has a natural component to it. Now, with the term borderline radioactivity, if we think of this in terms of natural radioactivity and not man-made, it has kind of the same element to it. And I think this particular term has really been used expressively to try to communicate the true nature of the damage that occurs. So if we think about radioactivity, there's a few different elements of it that are hazardous. If you're exposed to a lot of radioactivity, that can be damaging. So it's the intensity, but also how much time you spend being exposed is an element. And this is oftentimes how people have communicated this to me. They try to get close to the person with borderline personality disorder, but they can only stay close for so long, and they have to be careful how close they become. So again, we can see how this aligns with the construct of radioactivity. I've also heard the word toxicity used in the same way. And really, you could think about this very similarly in terms of the nature of toxicity and the nature of some of these relationships. So to explain the different elements, the different characteristics of this borderline trail of destruction, I'm going to organize this video in a way where I look at all the symptom criteria and discuss how those symptom criteria could contribute to this trail of destruction, contribute to the damage to interpersonal relationships. There are a lot of ways to organize material like this. I think this makes sense for this particular topic. So we'll start with the first symptom criteria and move to the last. There are 9 listed in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. And with the first symptom criterion, we see frantic efforts to avoid abandonment. So here it's pretty clear to see how this can cause damage to interpersonal relationships in other areas. We see frequent calling, texting, looking for continual reassurance, sometimes stalking. And this drives romantic partners away. It's the opposite of what's intended, of course, by the behavior. With this symptom criterion, it's difficult to maintain relationships. If somebody's always engaging in efforts to prevent rejection or to prevent being left alone, that leaves a relationship really as unstable. And this brings me to the second symptom criterion, an unstable relationship pattern. And here we see that this is partially due to what we see with the first symptom, but there's really much more to it. It's really a love-hate cycle, a cycle of idealization and devaluation. Sometimes this is known as splitting, seeing something as all good or all bad. And I think what happens a lot of times with this symptom criterion is that individuals who are in romantic relationships with individuals with borderline personality disorder simply tire of this cycle. They may enjoy the idealization phase somewhat, but they certainly don't enjoy the devaluation phase. And it ties in with the anger symptom criterion that I'll get to a little later. Romantic partners in these instances doubt if the cycle will ever stop, so eventually they permanently separate from the individual with borderline personality disorder. And this leaves a number of failed relationships behind that individual with the disorder. Again, very consistent with a trail of destruction. And much of the time, these relationships are really beyond repair. Not always, but much of the time in my experience. The next symptom criterion is identity disturbance. So this is an unstable self-image. This is extremely painful to the individual with borderline personality disorder. It does tie in with other symptom criteria like affective instability or the chronic feeling of emptiness. I'll get to both of those in a few moments. And it can be difficult for relationships. If somebody doesn't have a stable self-image, it can be difficult to navigate some of the nuances of forming particularly romantic relationships. But I don't see it as one of the major contributors to the idea of this trail of destruction. Now the next one is a major contributor. The symptom criterion is impulsivity in at least 2 areas that could be self-damaging. I'm going to group this together with the symptom criterion after that, which is suicidal behavior, gestures, and threats. These are independent symptom criteria, but really they're very similar, of course. These 2 constructs are oftentimes seen together. I think what happens a lot of times with these symptom criteria is that people care about the individual with borderline personality disorder. They don't want to see them harmed. They certainly don't want to see anything that even is remotely close to suicide. But eventually they just get burned out in terms of caring. They care a lot. They try to help the person when they damage themselves, when they end up in the hospital. So they really work and invest a lot of energy in that relationship. And again, a lot of caring, a lot of empathy and even sympathy. But eventually they just distance themselves for their own self-protection. after so many instances of impulsive behaviors that are harmful, it just becomes difficult to maintain that relationship sometimes. The next symptom criterion is affective instability. This is emotional dysregulation. And the problem here is that somebody never knows what to expect in social environments, in career environments, and this one has a particular impact on both of those. Employers want somebody who's reliable, and emotional dysregulation doesn't line up with the construct of reliability very well. So affective instability doesn't have some of the same consequences we see with the other symptom criteria, but it can be very harmful. It can contribute to the trail of destruction. Individuals want to have relationships that can be quantified, measured, they can understand what's going to happen, and affective instability really throws that off. It makes a person unpredictable. So the next symptom criterion is a chronic feeling of emptiness. And I see this as linked in quite a bit to the identity disturbance, but of course it's a separate symptom criterion. And we see here that somebody is seeking support because they have that chronic feeling of emptiness. So this can really tie in with leaning on people too much, and people can grow tired of that. We also see with the chronic feeling of emptiness sensation seeking, which of course is linked back to impulsivity and is usually thought of in the context of borderline personality disorder anyway as quite negative. So this one may not appear to have a strong link to this idea of the trail of destruction, but I think it actually does have somewhat of a connection here. Now the eighth symptom criteria is inappropriate intense anger. I'm going to come back to this one in a second. I'm going to skip to the ninth and revisit anger in a moment. So the ninth symptom criterion is paranoid ideation. And this is where somebody is suspicious of others. I think this links to the frantic efforts to avoid abandonment pretty closely. I think what we see here with paranoid ideation is it simply drives people away, similar to what we see with paranoid personality disorder. Also on the same symptom criterion, we see severe dissociation. This one could contribute to damaged relationships. It doesn't have really the same impact as paranoid ideation would, but these are again on the same symptom criterion. They're loaded on the ninth symptom criterion, and both could cause damage to relationships. So both do have negative consequences. So moving back to number 8, I wanted to save this one to the end because I think this is probably one of the most important symptoms of borderline personality disorder that contribute to a trail of destruction. What we see with this particular symptom criterion is not only the anger, but aggression and sometimes physical violence. And what I found here is if someone has a relationship with an individual with borderline personality disorder, and that person can endure the affective instability, the unstable relationship pattern, the frantic efforts to avoid abandonment, and all the other symptoms that may be present, a lot of times they still can't endure the anger. In particular, the aggression and the physical aggression, I think, really, for many people, is the line that they draw. When physical aggression occurs, when physical violence occurs, that's really the end of the relationship. So we see that people try to stick it out, they try to help the individual, they try to maintain a relationship with the individual, but the anger is just too much. And we even see this with mental health counselors. A lot of times mental health counselors are working with somebody with borderline personality disorder, and the anger just gets in the way so much or causes a problem at the agency, and they just can't endure it. They can't put up with the risk. They worry about their coworkers, they worry about some of the behaviors, sometimes they may have to call the police, and it just becomes too much. So the inappropriate intense anger, I think, really has the most significant connection to the trail of destruction in many ways. And we also see a wide range of difficulties associated with anger, like legal problems are fairly popular, employment difficulties would be fairly common, and of course the social and romantic relationships would see consequences from this as well. So anger is really far-reaching and fairly destructive. Again, one of the most significant factors we see with this trail of destruction. So now taking a step back and looking at this trail of destruction with borderline personality disorder, we do see that a lot of this is about setting boundaries. Individuals have to look at their own values and set the boundaries where it makes sense in terms of relating to anybody, including individuals with borderline personality disorder. Again, there's this difficult component because oftentimes people want to help the individual, but they also need to protect themselves. It is important to understand that borderline personality disorder is a mental disorder. The behavior is there because of symptoms. and improvement is definitely possible. Sometimes it takes a while, but I've seen amazing recoveries during my career. So despite this so-called trail of destruction, there is hope, and it's important to keep that in mind. I certainly appreciate that family members, friends, employers, and other people that relate to individuals with borderline personality disorder are put in a challenging position. But we have to work to understand the nature of the disorder and understand, of course, that people that have this disorder are people and they want to recover. And again, with this disorder, I don't really see this as something that's intentional. Everybody acts intentionally from time to time, regardless of whether they have a mental disorder or not. But borderline personality disorder has strong symptom manifestations, and these can distort how people see their behavior. They may not understand what they're doing and the effects of what they're doing. So again, understanding, compassion, and involving mental health counselors can go a long way in terms of helping somebody with borderline personality disorder. I hope you found this description of borderline personality disorder and the trail of destruction to be interesting. Thanks for watching.